Justin Fay is our presenter, and please come on up. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Doug, and good evening, and thank you for letting me come and speak with you today. Doug said my name is Justin Fay. I'm the campaign manager for the Minnesota Clean Energy and Jobs campaign. I've been in this role since August, so just a few months now, but I've been working on clean energy policy at the state capitol for quite a few years. For the last 6 legislative sessions, I've been the state lobbyist for the Sierra Club in Minnesota. So working on a pretty broad agenda of issues, including quite a bit of work on clean energy and climate. So these are issues that I've been fortunate enough to be able to work on for a long time, but now in a new role. So I'm going to hopefully do today is tell you a little bit about our campaign, give you a sense of sort of who works on clean energy at the state capitol, how do we do it. We'll do kind of a little background on some of the legislation from the last couple of years, our campaign and where it came from, and then talk about the session that's starting in just a couple of months. So what are some of the policies that we're going to be looking at moving related to clean energy this year? What's the outlook for those policies, especially after the recent election? And then at the end, we'll go through fairly quickly. I'll run through some kind of polling and messaging research that we had done a couple of months ago that I think is interesting and is kind of an important part of the context for when we think about clean energy and how to move public policy related to clean energy. So that's what we'll do today. If I ever descend into acronyms or using or am unclear, don't be afraid to interrupt me and ask me to be clarified. So a little history. In 2007, the legislature passed, and then Governor Pawlenty signed a landmark piece of legislation called the Next Generation Energy Act. That law was a wholesale change in Minnesota's state energy policy. And it did a whole bunch of what we now think of as sort of benchmark things, including setting Minnesota's first renewable energy standard, which is 25% by 2025 for all utilities in the state, except for Excel, which has a stronger, more aggressive standard of 30% by 2020. At the time this law was passed, it was the strongest renewable energy standard in the country, and kind of continued a tradition of Minnesota playing a leadership role, certainly in the Midwest, but really kind of across the country with regards to clean energy policy. The Next Generation Energy Act also set pretty aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals in state law. So current state law says it's the goal of the state of Minnesota to reduce carbon pollution or greenhouse gases by 80% by the year 2050. That was also by far the most aggressive such law in existence at the time that it was passed. And what's really exciting is since 2007, the law has been an overwhelming success. Every utility in the state of Minnesota is on track or ahead of schedule to meet the renewable energy standard that we passed in 2007. Some of them will be meeting their 2025 obligations within the next couple of years. So it's been a tremendous success story and has been a model that's been duplicated successfully by a number of states around the country. In 2013, Governor Dayton, following the 2012 elections, you may recall we had a pretty significant turnover in the composition of the state legislature after that election. Governor Dayton, at the start of the 2013 legislative session, issued a call to action, which, if my PowerPoint was working, would play for you right now. Since it's not, I'll just paraphrase what it was he said. He issued a call to action to state energy policy advocates, large users of energy, electric utilities, the legislature and state agencies to work together to plot out what the next steps are going to be. The way I think about it is you set goals, you meet goals, and then it comes time to set new goals. You don't stop just because you did what you said you were going to do. You plan your next piece of work. And that's really where we are with clean energy and renewables in the state of Minnesota right now. Utilities are required, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, to plan their file plans with the Public Utilities Commission that say where they're going to get electricity 15 years out, which means utilities are already have plans filed with the Public Utilities Commission that are projecting after the end of the existing renewable energy standard. So even though the law doesn't sort of reach its zenith for another 10 or 11 years, it really is time now to be talking about what our energy mix is going to look like in the state of Minnesota in the post-2025 timeframe. So in response to the governor's call to action, a number of organizations and advocacy leaders came together in the early part of 2013 to start talking about what would that look like? What would the next step look like? And what infrastructure do we need as an advocacy community and as clean energy supporters in order to make some sort of significant step forward a reality? And out of those conversations grew the Minnesota Clean Energy and Jobs campaign. Since 2013, our campaign has grown to include more than 60 organizations statewide, representing a pretty broad array of stakeholders and interests. You can kind of see a sampling up here. We have environmental groups, energy policy advocates, labor unions, faith community leaders, youth advocates, clean energy businesses. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but it's a pretty broad set of stakeholders that are all working together towards a set of common goals, policy goals. Some of our campaign founding principles, our goal is to make significant and verifiable policy advancements by the end of the 2015 legislative session. So we're not a permanent organization. The campaign was conceived from day one as a short-term, a 2 to 3 year initiative to take advantage of a critical mass among the advocacy community, a favorable political climate for moving clean energy policy in the state of Minnesota, and then sunsetting, hopefully after the successful 2015 legislative session. We also want to make sure that we're doing a couple of other things to position Minnesota for continued long-term success by advocates and stakeholders long after the campaign goes away. We're also working very hard to raise the profile of clean energy generally in the state of Minnesota, telling the success stories. Those of you who are working in the industry and Minnesotans who've been doing such a good job of taking advantage of new opportunities in clean energy. And then to leave our network and our stakeholders and allies in a position of strength. So really focusing on opportunities to build our base, build the capacity of organizations that care about clean energy, that do advocacy work in the clean energy space, and making sure that they're in a position to be more powerful and more effective advocates moving forward, even when the campaign no longer exists. Yes? Yes, I will. They're on that laptop, so whoever has that laptop has the slides now. So our campaign is structured around a steering committee that's made up of about 12 organizations that represent sort of a representative subset of the coalition. But the real work of the campaign happens in 4 what we call subtables that kind of do the things you would expect to see any campaign do. So we have an organizing subtable that focuses on grassroots mobilization, groups like Sierra Club, Clean Water Action, the Isaac Walton League that do grassroots mobilization, that have members that they can turn out to events, write letters to the editor, make phone calls to their legislators, and things like that. Communications table that works on both paid and earned media. Meeting with editorial boards, making sure that reporters are briefed and have good information that they're using to write about when they cover clean energy at the Capitol. Policy table that reviews proposed policies that we want to work on. The campaign is considering moving at the state legislature and then vetting the actual language of the bills that we're moving through the legislative process. And then an advocacy table, which is really our lobbyists, the folks who knock on the doors of the state legislators and encourage them to do the right thing. Our campaign timeline, so what this really just shows you is what I was saying a moment ago. This is a short-term, a 2 to 3 year effort, starting in spring of 2013 and running through the end of the 2015 legislative session. I'm not going to go through this in detail. What it's trying to tell you is that we've sort of been on two simultaneous tracks. So building towards a successful big policy win in 2015, hopefully, but along the way making sure that we're doing some significant things at the legislature in 2013 and in 2014. And I'll talk about what some of those victories have been. Some of the work that we're doing right now, so the kind of fall 2014 of the Clean Energy and Jobs campaign. The state fair was a major push, and I want to thank MRES for letting us take advantage of / work with your space at the state fair. It was a very, very successful. We had hundreds of Minnesotans sign pledges in support of clean energy, and that's a great tool and it was a great momentum for us heading into the fall election season. We've been doing organizing work in legislative districts where we know we have sort of legislative swings. List enhancement, that's helping membership organizations do a better job of using tools that are available to manage their databases and their membership lists. That sounds like kind of a wonky, nerdy thing, but it's actually, there are some really, really powerful tools out there that we found a lot of our organizations, especially some of the smaller environmental organizations, haven't been doing a very good job of taking advantage of. And so we want to take advantage of the campaign's resources to really sort of improve that infrastructure. And that's a resource that's going to be a valuable addition to the clean energy stakeholder community for many years. Candidate education. We had a series of meetings with candidates running for public office, primarily for the legislature, all over the state, from July through September. We had good participation from candidates from both parties. We offered them information on clean energy policies and lots of information on how to talk about clean energy, how to turn clean energy into a winning issue politically. Hopefully some of that information stuck and they're going to bring it back with them to the state capitol in 2015. And then of course the election, you may have heard of it, there was an ad or two on TV, just happened a week ago, and we're now in the phase of digesting those results and planning some next steps. Just a couple of highlights from work that we've done over the last few months. This is from the end of the legislative session last year. It's a rally we held at the state capitol. We had about 600 Minnesotans come out and rally in support of clean energy and action on climate. Governor Dayton spoke, Congresswoman McCollum spoke, and a number of other state leaders on clean energy. This follows a similar event we did the year before where we had 1,000 Minnesotans show up. And this is a picture from the state fair. That's Governor Dayton. He's talking to a young volunteer from an organization called the Minnesota Youth Environmental Network. That's a member organization of our campaign. What you can't see in this picture is right off the shot, she's holding a piece of paper with a set of clean energy and jobs talking points and suggested questions for candidates on it. So she did a great job of going right up to the governor at the state fair and asking him questions about his positions on clean energy. This is a strategy that we used really effectively at the state fair, I thought, this year. Had a lot of conversations with candidates for public office and other kind of thought leaders that were at the fair about clean energy, and made sure that people were talking about clean energy issues. So, as we've been doing all of this, of course, we're doing it with an eye towards moving clean energy legislation in 2015. So what is the political context look like now, especially now that the election has come and gone, the dust is settled, what happens next? So the governor and Senate are, of course, unchanged from the last 2 years. The governor, because he was reelected, and the Senate was not on the ballot in 2014. So the DFL controls both the governorship and has the majority of the state Senate. The big change at the state level in Minnesota in 2014 was a change in control of the Minnesota House. So the DFL had control of the state House for the previous 2 years. We have a new GOP margin of about 10 members in the state House. And just in the last week, they've elected new leadership and are doing the business of kind of setting up their committee structure and making decisions about who within their caucus are going to be leaders on these issues. So there's a lot of a lot of waiting that's still happening for those of us who do advocacy work at the state capitol. We don't even though it's been almost 2 weeks now, we don't know who we're going to be focusing on and who some of the key decision makers are going to be. We're keeping a very close eye on it, of course. This is an important thing to note, and I think it's an important piece of the kind of context pie as we think about getting ready for the next legislative session. Energy was really not a high-profile issue in the 2014 election. We certainly were on the ground at events talking to candidates, and other folks were doing the same thing. But if you looked at the mail that I'm sure many of you were getting, watching TV ads about the issues that both the Democrats and the Republicans were highlighting, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion of clean energy. That was sort of frustrating to me personally while the election was going on, because I think these are really important issues and they should be talked about more. But as we're thinking about the next legislative session, it's sort of an okay thing, right? There's nobody who got elected who can say that they got elected on an anti-clean energy mandate. So even though control of the State House flipped from a party or control of some folks who did some good things on clean energy, opposing that was not seen by anybody as a winning political strategy. And so that's an important, that's I think an important takeaway, and you'll see why when we get to some of the polling data at the end of my presentation. That was the right move. That you don't get elected by opposing clean energy in Minnesota. So the overall outlook for clean energy policy advances in 2015, I would say it's mixed, but there's definitely a lot of potential for progress. Having divided government doesn't mean that nothing can happen. In fact, in 2007, when the Next Generation Energy Act passed, we had a DFL legislature and a GOP governor. So the most significant piece of renewable energy policy that this state has ever passed came out of an environment where we had divided government. So it can be done. What happens when you have divided government is the legislative sausage making gets really, really messy. So it's going to be an eventful, entertaining legislative session for any of you who are political junkies. You'll love it. But the outlook is we've got a legitimate chance to take some significant steps forward this year. This is another important piece of kind of the landscape of the politics of clean energy in Minnesota. Advocates for clean energy are at a structural disadvantage when we go to the state capitol and advocate for, say, an increase in the renewable energy standard or increased energy efficiency policies. This is a pretty impressive, powerful list of legislative actors that are lined up in opposition to most of the things that most of us in this room would say Minnesota should be doing. Large business groups, utilities, particularly rural utilities, and industry groups for the fossil fuel industry will all oppose increasing the renewable energy standard in 2015. To kind of put that in context, at the start of the 2013, we did a little kind of power mapping analysis of our advocacy community, and we found pretty darn close to an 8-to-1 advantage for opponents of clean energy at the Capitol in terms of number of lobbyists that were going to be working on the issues that we wanted to work on. That's a big, big advantage for folks that want to stop what we would call progress. Now, we have other resources. We have members in grassroots organizations. We have facts on our side. We have a lot of, I think, really good lobbyists that work for us or with us. But this is still a pretty significant, gives you a sense of the size of the challenge that we're up against and how important it is for people who have expertise, who are involved professionally in the industry to speak up and to be active in the political process and the legislative process if you want to see action by the state legislature. So many of you are probably all very familiar with this. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but in 2013 we passed a significant piece of legislation called the Minnesota Solar Energy Jobs Act. This is an important little side note here. As great a bill as that was, and as many important steps that we took forward with it, it was far from a perfect bill, and we had to make some really significant concessions in order to push it across the finish line. This dynamic has not changed in any way heading into 2015. So again, it's going to be really, really important for all of us as a community of folks who care about clean energy and want to see all utilities doing good things for Minnesota to speak up and to be active in the process. The one thing I'll just say about this, I'm very, very proud of this bill, in spite of its flaws and its warts. There are a number of things that we accomplished here in 2013 that are now being modeled around the country. And particularly here in the Midwest, Minnesota is an outlier in a really, really positive way on solar energy. And that's a testament to our state officials and to the advocacy community that we have in Minnesota. 2014, so the session that just finished this past spring, was a little quieter. You may have heard Governor Dayton called it the unsession, which was code for we don't want to do anything because we're running for election. That said, there were some modest steps forward on clean energy in 2014 that our campaign worked on, including a new revolving loan fund for large energy projects, particularly industrial, commercial, and public buildings. That is a program I think has a lot of potential, not just to actually deliver clean energy, but it was a program that we worked on collaboratively with a number of stakeholders that many of us haven't before. So large users of electricity, think taconite mines and paper mills up north, that tend to be a little skeptical when groups like the Sierra Club or Clean Water Action come along with their ideas about clean energy. We actually had a shared victory together with some of those groups in 2014. That's a pretty big deal. We made some steps forward in reforming the Certificate of Need process to make it easier for particularly wind developers to develop projects in Minnesota for sale outside of the state. And then we actually passed a new law that says utilities have to include as part of their resource plans that they file with the Public Utilities Commission, planning for how they're going to meet the specific benchmarks that exist in Minnesota's greenhouse gas reduction law. That's just adding some kind of the first teeth to the goals that we set in the 2007 Next Generation Energy Act. So, what comes next? I want to preface this by saying that as of 6:30 on November 13th, our campaign has not adopted a formal policy agenda for the 2015 legislative session. But we do have a number of ideas that we're exploring that I think is appropriate to share with you all. There's two policies that I think are likely to be the highest profile pieces of the clean energy conversation in 2015. The first is a 40% by 2030 renewable energy standard. That's a pretty big step forward for Minnesota from 25% by 2025. This would put Minnesota back on top in terms of being a national leader on renewable portfolio standards like this. I believe there's one other state that has a 40% RES right now. It's Hawaii, which doesn't really count. So this is an ambitious undertaking, and I think we're in a good position to move it forward. In the last couple of weeks, we've had some significant developments in this area of policy. Just last week, the Department of Commerce released the results of a clean energy integration study that it's been working on since the 2013 session. It was another lower profile part actually of the bill that we passed in 2013. That basically concluded from a technical perspective, there are no showstoppers to doing 40% by 2030 RES. That was that's an important piece of research to have documented and to have in place, and it was done at the request of Republican lawmakers in 2013. So that's, having that in advance of the 2015 session is important. The second policy that a lot of folks are exploring is ratcheting up our goals and expectations for energy efficiency in the state of Minnesota. Currently in state law, there's a program called the Conservation Improvement Program, and it requires utilities to achieve a 1.5% annual savings from year to year. It's called an Energy Efficiency Resource Standard. What we're likely to propose is taking our 1.5% goal and turning it into a 2% goal. That's a pretty big increase. That's 25% increase over what we have now. That's in line with the most aggressive states in the Midwest. So it's not a number that was pulled out of thin air. It's a law that is in existence in similar forms in other states. I believe Michigan has a 2% standard. So we think it's probably time for Minnesota to take a look at this. A couple of other policies that probably won't be as high profile but I think have a lot of potential to do some good things. There are a number of folks working on a rural renewable energy tax credit. So trying to pair together a couple of gaps that we have right now in our state policy framework. The first is that there's not a whole lot that's targeted specifically towards clean energy deployment in the rural part of the state. And politically, we've had some challenges talking to rural lawmakers about some of the clean energy policies that we want to move forward with. But there's also some technologies that have kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit with regards to incentives and rebates here in the state of Minnesota. For example, small-scale distributed wind, on-grid battery storage, solar thermal, ground source heating and cooling. So what a tax credit would do is provide an additional incentive for some of those technologies that need a little bit of an extra oomph to get up to scale, much in the same way that we did for solar PV with the 2013 legislation. And then clean energy communities is a proposal that would develop best management practices for clean energy policies and procedures at the municipal level. Those of you who work in the industry, I'm sure, are very well aware that Minnesota has a real patchwork of permitting fees and permitting requirements from one city to the next that can vary quite a bit. It's inefficient. It creates artificial and unnecessary barriers to improving clean energy and to implementing clean energy at the local level. We think solving that is not going to be as challenging as it should be. So what this proposal would do is develop a set of voluntary best management practices and then recognize local units of government that successfully implement those best management practices. Beyond the legislature, I think it's important to bear in mind that there are other things happening in the clean energy policy space. Probably the highest profile one is the EPA's Clean Power Plan. So this was proposed by President Obama in this past June. It's currently out for public comment. So through December 1st, the public is invited to weigh in on the EPA's proposed rule. The final rule is expected to be delivered in this coming June, assuming there's not a further delay. Minnesota, under the draft rule that was released last year, has some pretty significant, there's some pretty high level of expectations for what Minnesota should be able to accomplish relative to other states. And an important part of meeting our state's obligations under this law, assuming it becomes enacted this spring, is going to be a significant ramp up in deployment of clean energy. So this is just one more reason why increasing and extending the clean energy standard is really, really timely in 2015. Renewable energy standard, excuse me. Another process that's underway that many of you probably have not heard of and will not be as high profile is the Environmental Quality Board, which has a program underway called Climate Solutions Economic Opportunities. or CZO is their acronym that they're using. What that process is going to be doing is looking at climate policy options economy-wide. So not just limited to the energy sector, but including things like transportation and land use, natural resources policy. And really evaluating what are things that the state isn't doing right now that it could or should be doing to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. This follows up on a similar process that took place about 7 years ago called the Climate Change Advisory Group that was spearheaded by Governor Pawlenty before he decided to run for president and decided that climate change didn't exist. He actually did some really, really great things at the state level to position Minnesota for some significant action. That unfortunately, a lot of which has sat on the shelf collecting dust since then. So this is an opportunity to revisit some of those policy options. It's happening concurrently with the legislative session. So this is it's a great opportunity for those of us who do advocacy work, certainly, but also members of the public who care about clean energy and climate policy to engage with leaders within the Dayton administration on some options and policy steps that Minnesota is going to be considering over the next few years. So I want to wrap up my talk today by running through, and I'm going to do this pretty quickly, running through the results of some polling that we had done this past summer. That I think is interesting stuff, and I think it helps sort of flush out the full context of where we are as a state in our collective thinking about some of these issues. And it gives you an idea of kind of how and why we're going to be approaching the legislature this year in the way that we are. A little bit about the polling and methodology. We use a bipartisan team of pollsters. Dave Metz from a firm called FM3 that does polling for Democratic candidates. Lori Weigel is a pollster from Public Opinion Strategies, which is a Republican firm. Both of them have done partisan candidate polling in the state of Minnesota for years, so they're very familiar with the state. We did telephone interviews with about 2,500 voters. This is actually a regional poll, but we do have within that, there's a statistically significant subsample of Minnesota respondents. Most of the numbers we look at are going to be Midwest region. In a couple of places they'll be Minnesota specific, and I'll try to be clear about which is which. So energy as an issue was not at the top of the list of priorities that people were thinking about this year as they were thinking about who they were going to vote for in the run-up to the election. You'll notice it's not on this slide. There it is. On the second slide. So solidly in the kind of mid-tier. A relevant issue, but not the top concern of very many people that were polled. This, I think, is interesting and sort of further emphasizes an example of what advocates are up against when they go work on clean energy policy. We asked respondents to sort of describe their attitudes towards, question actually asked a list of different entities, but I pulled these two out because I thought they were interesting. Your local electric utility, 73% either strongly or somewhat approve of the job of their utility. Only about half of people approve of environmental organizations as a block. So when utilities oppose clean energy policy, it's a formidable barrier. We asked voters respondents to talk about, or to share their opinions on a variety of different potential sources of energy. This is a pretty encouraging slide. We've asked this question in polling for a number of years. This year, for the first time, we included energy efficiency. We hadn't polled on that before, and it just really pops as an issue that really resonated with voters. But you can see this sort of breaks into like 3 tiers, with efficiency, wind, and solar at the top, the most overwhelmingly supportive sources of energy. Hydropower and natural gas, seen broadly as better than conventional sources of energy, but maybe not quite as exciting as wind and solar in kind of the mid-tier. And then bringing up the rear are traditional nuclear and coal. Energy efficiency was so popular it crossed all partisan boundaries. And if I showed you slides that broke down the support by any other demographic group, you'd see the same thing. Everybody wants us to be more efficient. Everybody also really likes wind energy. 70% of Republicans are supportive of increasing the use of wind power in Minnesota. Voters increasingly see many more reasons why we should be doing increasing renewables than they have in the past. One that jumps out to me on this list is this one right here. A couple years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. But people are really starting to understand that renewable energy isn't just the energy of the future, that we're building it out successfully in Minnesota, and that it's not driving significant increases in their utility bills. And that's a significant shift in public opinion that's going to be to our advantage. Skip over that. Voters see renewables as a significant contributor to the Minnesota economy. Again, and to respond to this question, it actually did better than tourism, which surprised me. But people get the link between clean energy and economic development and jobs. You can see here the same question about both renewable energy and energy efficiency being connected to job growth in the state of Minnesota. And this is borne out by the facts. Some of you may have seen the DEAN, which is the Department of Employment and Economic Development, last month released a study that they've been working on for quite a while that sort of mapped the clean energy economy in the state of Minnesota and found more than 15,000 Minnesotans are currently employed in the clean energy sector. And that over the past decade, the clean energy sector is growing at roughly 7 times the rate of the economy as a whole. That's a pretty compelling success story. People, again, this is just showing what I talked about before. People increasingly see renewables as a cost-effective option for generating electricity. We don't want to talk about renewables as costing more, but if we did, people are willing to pay for it. The positive attributes of clean renewable electricity are broadly seen by the public as significant enough that they're willing to accept some modest cost increases in their utility bills if necessary.
Give a hot spot on how much they're willing to accept?
Yeah. Yep.
To me, yes, what do you think about that? But do you have a price point where people generally go negative or stay on?
Over $4 a month, it starts to go over the cliff. It starts to decline quite a bit. More than $10 a month, you'd see very, very little support. Higher than that's probably the top threshold. But from 4 to 10, it declines. I don't think we went higher than 4 in this particular poll, but we've polled up higher than that in the past, and that was kind of what we saw. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these slides, but I think this first one is interesting. I should have the right to put solar in my own home and pay for it how I choose. 69% of people strongly agree. People don't like being told by anyone, whether it's the government, whether it's their utilities, whether it's their homeowners association, that they can't do what they want to do with their own property. So this is as a frame for thinking about clean energy. This is a good one. This resonates really strongly with conservatives as well. And so when you hear candidates for elected office or interests talking about initiatives to block particularly solar, this is the comeback. It's about freedom, it's about the right to generate your own electricity, and that's a winning argument with the public. We asked specifically about increasing the renewable energy standard. And we asked, in this poll, we asked 50%, which is higher than what is likely to be put on the table, at least for this coming legislative session. And we found 70% support for that policy. That's, it's not huge, but it's a pretty significant margin of Minnesotans saying they support a pretty substantial increase in the deployment of renewables in the state of Minnesota. Similar to with cost, you see some sort of scalability. The more you increase that percentage, the more the lower the support. So in past years, we have polled on 40%, and we get bigger numbers than this. If we were to poll higher than this, we'd get some smaller levels of support. So people do have a sense that there is, at some point, it's possible to push too far, but they're willing to push quite a bit farther than certainly most of our elected officials or electric utilities are likely to do. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this slide. The important thing that it's showing you, though, is that there are a lot of different ways and proposals for how, as a state, we might try to increase the use of renewables, and many of them are supported broadly by the public. So it's not as simple as, yes, people like renewables, but they don't like the policy mechanisms that can help us get there. They actually like the policy ideas quite a bit on their own merits. So in sort of conclusion, some kind of bottom line takeaways from not just this poll, but some other messaging and public opinion research that we've done over the last couple of years. When you talk about clean energy with a public audience, highlight the jobs potential of clean energy. People get it, people like it. Jobs and economic issues continue to be of significant concern to the public, and people buy that clean energy is a significant part of the solution. Talk about the need for access, both from the perspective of I can put solar on my house if I want to, but also that all utilities, all customers should have access regardless of who their utility is. So we shouldn't be requiring some utilities to do things and other utilities not to. That's an area where the public is solidly with us. And don't forget to include a value statement. People see value in moving towards clean energy consistently that is separate from and distinct from their own economic or the state of Minnesota's sort of economic benefits. It's the right thing to do, is a frame that will work with almost any audience that you might, or any person that you might be interacting with. One thing you don't want to do is, and it kills me as an environmentalist, it kills me to say this, don't rely on climate change as your lead-off argument or the only argument or your only reason for why we need to do clean energy. Unfortunately, that's a frame that loses people who would otherwise be with us. If we were to put climate change on that list of concerns, of issue concerns, what you'd see is about half really, really concerned and about half not at all concerned and not a whole lot in the middle. And what that's telling you is there's a lot of people that support, especially when you think about the other research, there's a lot of people that support clean energy that are turned off by climate as a message. So I'm not going to say don't talk about climate change. We have to talk about climate change, but you've got to talk about it in the context of all the great things that clean energy does. It reduces pollution, it builds our economy, it generates jobs, and it's the right thing to do. That's it. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take some questions. Yeah.
I got you too large on the 1.5% to 2% change.
Yep.
I don't understand what.
Sure. So state law right now requires utilities to achieve savings in their sales of electricity of 1.5% relative to what they would have sold if they weren't doing efficiency. So an example would be a a utility projects its electricity growth for the coming year, it could give away a bunch of high efficiency light bulbs to customers. That then, as a result of having done that, the utility has lower electricity demand. That's the 1.5%. So it's reducing demand for electricity year over year. Does that make sense?
Well, that's a pretty good example, but if you have 15 or 30 years or something, you know what they do.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that they can do. So like when if you go on Excel's website, you can find if you home energy audits. They do that at least partly because of this law, that they're required to meet energy efficiency goals in state law. One of the ways they do that is by, they come to your house, you do an energy audit. It's not that expensive to them. You might get a little piece of weather stripping or maybe some caulk around a window or something. That when utility does it at the scale of like their whole customer base, adds up to quite a bit of savings, and it's almost always more cost effective than building new generation.
They come to my house and say, you need copper on the window.
Yeah,
Do I really do it?
we'll do it for you, usually.
Well, if I may, I would suggest you do, go to the website. I work with an organization that provides that service, and there are many service providers, and the opportunities are customized to your needs. And so the folks that go to the house are going to look at the home and what your concerns are. So I would like to suggest that it may be more than a little weather stripping, and I suspect there's a little call but not to diminish the gentleman's message. Contacting your utility company for that service could very well be useful to you, and be one of the big steps we all need to take.
And you'll find also that there's a range of what you can do. There's basic home energy audits. There's much more expensive things that you could have done as well.
I think that's also called conservation improvement program. And
Yes.
some of that money goes into solar rebates with some of the restaurant utilities. I think that's 5% of the SIP funds. So would that be an automatic increase in the solar rebates?
Potentially. Well, it would increase the size of the pot, I'll put it that way.
The pool is too small now. I mean, we don't really want to compare that.
We all do better when we all do better, so growing the pot is a pretty good place to start. Okay.
You already brought up the SIP pool. You talked about bringing in the municipals and co-ops into the mix, especially when it comes to the incentive packages for solar. How do you plan on funding that?
We plan on funding that?
Currently, like say the Minnesota program comes out of the SIP funds, and those funds are distributed under the IOUs for the portion that they paid into the fund. Communities and co-ops don't have a lot of SIP funds available, so how are you going to finance any incentive packages or bring those into the mix?
Sure. So the only like incentive policy that I think I talked about was a rural tax credit. That could be paid out of kind of any. In practice, it's going to be a small enough amount of money that's actually being used that it could pretty easily come out of the general fund. We're talking in the single-digit millions of dollars. The state level, that's not a whole lot of money. If that program were to be used really, really broadly and successfully, then you might have to find a home for it somewhere.
So I have a philosophy that the squeaky wheel thing it's the worst thing. One of my concerns is with your organization that if you plan on hanging your hat in 2015, that we won't have an advocate. We have advocates, we're all advocates, and we know that, but I'm concerned about not having that kind of strong advocacy at the Capitol that I think we need, because I think if you hang your hat up, I think that the legislature will actually not get a strong message about the importance of this work.
I don't disagree. It's going to be really important for the organizations that make up our campaign to be really thoughtful about what comes next. Building a campaign out to this scale, though, it's not sustainable indefinitely. It's taken a pretty big, significant investment on the part of a number of the organizations that are involved in our effort that they just don't have the resources to do on a permanent basis. So what the campaign was really about was trying to take advantage of short-term opportunities, and we're going to have to, in the years ahead, recalibrate and start putting together the next set of short-term opportunities and the infrastructure to take advantage of it. I don't disagree, though, with the general observation that we're under-resourced, underrepresented as advocates, and that anybody going away is a bad thing. I completely agree.
I was just going to congratulate the 6-member coalition. It was quite an accomplishment, and a dialogue that must have to go on and suggests that after 2015, another look at this will likely be taken real well.
Yeah, and I think, the campaign might cease to exist as a campaign, but the relationships that have been sort of gelled as a result of having put this initiative together, hopefully will live on, and hopefully that helps to speak to the previous question a little bit, that we have set a model for how, the Sierra Club and the sheet metal workers, as two kind of extreme examples, can sit at a table together and work collaboratively. There's no reason that needs to stop when the campaign sunsets at the end of the year. And so that's, of all of the things that we've accomplished, that's the piece that we have to really hold on to, in my opinion.
So a couple of things here. The lobbyists for and against the ratio of 2013. Do you expect that to be different? And of the groups that showed a broad opposition, assuming that ratio of lobbyists is somewhat different, which of these groups seem to be moving forward? Do you have any?
If it's changing, it's getting worse. As far as the ratio goes, I would say we, as a campaign, will be able to marshal a similar slate of resources this year. And in fairness, we were able to add some capacity in 2013 after that slide was put together. We'll be able to do the same thing this year. So we'll have some significant ability to talk to legislators. As far as that list of opposition, there's nothing on that list where I could say that they're not opposed or that I see a path where they're going to be advocates in the near future. But they do have different perspectives. The Chamber of Commerce has a different set of motivations than Xcel Energy does, which has a different set of motivations than the munis and co-ops. And the degree of opposition certainly varies. One of the things I always try to bring up when I have an opportunity to talk to folks who work in the clean energy field, join your Chamber of Commerce. If you're a small business owner, particularly if you are outside of the Twin Cities or outside of Minneapolis proper, join your Chamber of Commerce. Change starts from within, and the way that we can turn, that's a great example. They're a great example of, I think, the lowest hanging fruit on that list of an entity that we could turn into not being such a strong opponent. Clean energy is a growth industry. In my opinion, it's absurd that advocates for business in Minnesota are advocating against one of, if not the fastest growing business sectors in the state. So that, when I think about what, on that list, where can we enact change, that's the one that sort of jumps off the list for me. And I should say too that the utilities are not all created equal. Some of, it's not an accident that Xcel Energy has a higher renewable energy standard, and that 2007 law was written with them absolutely sitting at the table, and they deserve credit for that. So.
On the previous slide, you talked about messaging and duties,
Yep.
and using, job growth
Is there like another set of sub-bullets under that, or keep doing studies or reports been issued in terms of where the jobs will be in 5 years, 10 years, types of jobs? Those, I mean, has that work been really put together to embellish on that
Yes.
asset?
Yes, and I unfortunately don't have something that I can pull out of my pocket and hand you right now. But yeah, we have there are materials that have been put together by deed as part of the report that they did. And we're, as a campaign, developing some material that we're going to use this year at the legislature, and I'll make sure that they get to Laura, or get to you guys through MRES.
Let me take a crack at that. That's a pretty good question. It's a really significant development in our campaign. It's been somewhat problematic to the very problematic over the last few years when we've gone into hearings to provide testimony for our bills, that we've had very strong support from the Department of Commerce. And while we've been at the dais, at the mic saying this is really about jobs, not just about energy, we've never had D, sitting there with us. And now we do. And what they've done is they've broken it out by sector. So there are 5 different clean energy sectors: solar, wind, energy efficiency, bioenergy, and microgrid. And what they've done is that they've calculated the job density in each of those sectors, including solar. We think their numbers are a little understated. It's always better to come back next year and say, look how well we grew. But it's like Justin said, it's not just the numbers. The wage levels are very compelling. The growth in each of those sectors is very compelling. It's tough for people to say this isn't correct. So we're in a much, much better position than we've been historically. And even without them in the past, we've been able to make the argument we're in a much stronger position now. And we've got people who are working full time, on these issues. My friend Jack Lemke, who's from the industry, and Kim Havey, at Commerce, are working on, actually developing businesses in the state. So there's some really important developments, and I don't want to take away from any of the other advocacy work that is necessary, but we have allies and real data that we've not had before that's going to make it a lot easier for us to make the case.
And one thing I'd add to that is DEED does a really good job talking about their study. I've heard them present it a couple of times. I bet they'd come to an MRES meeting and be more than happy to share some of their information with you all.
The only other point I would add to that, and I'll be brief, is that the CZO study is going to do some of the same thing. It's not a mistake, it's climate solutions and economic opportunities, because they're going to be modeling, for example, a 3% and a 10% solar energy standard, and what are the consequent outcomes from that. In other words, they're going to be looking at the cost. What's the cost to get to that level? But what are the offsets in terms of economic development? And those offsets are going to be really easy to understand and clear to people, so we can make our arguments even more strongly than we have in the past.
Let's give Justin a hand.